Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to spend some time, especially in the second hour, getting back to some of the issues in the news. We had the oral arguments yesterday before the Supreme Court on this case of Coach Kennedy, so we're going to talk about what that means in terms of religious liberty. Going to spend probably a fairly significant amount of time talking about Twitter and Elon Musk and what this means and some of the reaction to it as well. Also, you have a federal judge blocking the attempt to end Title 42. What does that mean in terms of immigration? A variety of other topics we will be getting into next hour. But our first hour, we want to focus on not only a book, but an expert that will help us understand a little bit more about issues like Islam, civilization, jihad, and the rest. This is a topic we've addressed many times before, but it's been quite a while. And so we bring to the microphone Dr. Mark Christian. He is the Executive Director of Global Faith and also the Vice President of Arabs for Israel. We have information about his book. I'm holding it up right now because I think you'll really enjoy his story, The Apostate, My Search for Truth, and an individual that we will be talking to, and as we always do, opening up the phones to give you a chance to ask some questions or make some comments in this first hour. First of all, Dr. Mark Christian, thank you so very much for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be with you and your listener this morning.
Well, let me just say, first of all, that your book goes through in such detail your life, and I thought it would be good to at least delve into, of course, a 300-page book, because I learned a lot about your background, about especially your father. Even though I've written on Islam, and we talk about it quite often, there were some aspects of that I think would be helpful for all of our listeners. But then I want to get into, of course, all the other areas that you've developed. But first of all, I mean, in some respects, as people read through your book, and we have information about it on our website, they will not only learn about you, but along the way learn about kind of the authoritarian way in which Islam is foisted upon each member of the family, and how strict obedience is essential if you just want to survive.
Absolutely. So, as a matter of fact, I used personal stories and as examples of how Muslim lives look like. I used myself, I used my father, I used my mother. I made myself extremely vulnerable, actually, in this book. And the reason I did that is because I thought that the cause of teaching people and made people understand how Islam looks like and what Islam looks like is way bigger and important task than actually putting myself out there. So I took that upon me. Hopefully, I will survive this, but I am also praying that this will be an educational tool that will eliminate lots of deception, lots of lies, lots of confusion that has been going on since 9/11 and since after in our churches, in our government, in our midst, in our communities. I have seen that firsthand. Breaks my heart. It's time to get the truth out.
Well, again, given the fact that you grew up in Egypt, I mean, some people might think of that's a somewhat progressive country. It's one thing to have a country that is just dominated by ayatollahs, imams, and has Sharia law. But I think, if nothing else, you help us understand that your father, being an imam himself, being in the military, the Egyptian military, he was very strict. And just doing something as simple as going to the movies would require a beating of you. And so talk about that, those early years of what it was like to try to earn his respect and also to follow under the dictates of the revelation of Allah.
You are absolutely right. Egypt is a very kind of open-minded, some sort of a progressive country, not like Turkey, for example, but very similar, very, very close to that. But that does not stop individuals to live up to their faith and to live up to their conviction, no matter where they are. And that is definitely very clear in my story, in my book. And when I look at the examples of myself, my father, my mother, and others that I brought into the book, you can see clearly that all of us, when I was a Muslim included, it was not trying to please each other or try to please a community, but to please and to be submissive to a master who we believe that this is what God is, and we are nothing other than slaves, all of us, to him, and we have to do whatever it takes to please that master. Do not anger him. Do not create any kind of problem for us in this life or in the afterlife. And that was a huge big deal. What is going to happen in the afterlife? And many Muslims are living, not many Muslims, I can tell you actually with certainty that every Muslim today is under the heavy weight of sin, worried about what is going to happen in the afterlife to them. Many Muslims are trying to get away with some sin that they can do. And the term sin is so huge and so wide and so wide brush in Islam more than anything else. Everything is guarded and governed by the teachings of Islam, every aspect of life and so forth. So going back to myself, I think it's going to come to as a surprise to many people in the West that any kind of music is forbidden in Islam. Any kind of art is forbidden in Islam. Any kind of movies or entertainment is forbidden in Islam. And that goes back to the same concept that Muslims, other than or human beings in general, are called to be submissive to Allah as a slave to a master. And you are not supposed to use any minute of your life or any gift that God gave you for something for yourself, but always using it for Allah and for the Creator in the mindset of Muslims. So when I, get out of the way and decided to go watch a movie, and actually it was not a decision of my own, but of my own mother, who took me when I was like 5 years old to go watch a movie because she liked that movie, and I was almost sleeping mostly in the movie theater. When I got back, I received the wrath of my dad on what I have done. And that was a teaching woman in my life that made a change in my life, I think till today, that tuned me into what I'm supposed to be doing to please Allah, what is my role in life, and who is my Creator. And I was introduced to Allah, the idea of God in Islam. Allah is, and He is a very judgmental, very angry. There is no place for budging and forgiveness and grace except by hard work, and that was the beginning of my life.
Again, we're going to take a break and come back and continue our conversation, but I'll hold up our little booklet that we've made available in the past, a biblical point of view on Islam, in which we help you understand, of course, the major divisions of Islam, the 5 pillars of Islam, but most importantly in terms of witnessing, because we have found that one of the most effective ways to witness to your Muslim friends is to talk about the love of God, because as Mark Christian is talking about, there's sort of a master-slave relationship in Islam, whereas Christians, we can call God our Father. I mean, just think about that. The Lord's Prayer, our Father, is how we begin. We take that for granted, and we take for granted the fact that God loves us and has a plan for our life. So it is a very different world, and in some respects, one of the most important things you can do when you talk to your Muslim friends is to talk about the love of God. Of course, also share about your testimony, but also even in terms of eternal security, we just mentioned that as well. A Muslim really never knows whether or not he or she will be able to achieve heaven, yet we can stand on the promises that are found in God's Word. Let's take a break. We will continue our conversation with Dr. Mark Christian right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As President Joe Biden was leaving the NATO summit in Europe, he talked about his belief that the U.S. should lead in this new world order. No one in the administration felt this remarkable comment should be cleaned up or clarified or corrected. Fortunately, Colonel Oliver North felt that it was worthy of some comment. The idea of a new world order goes back to the 1940s when H.G. Wells published his nonfiction book on the New World Order. He is best known as the science fiction writer who penned The War of the Worlds. He was also a collectivist who believed that a global government was the best way to protect human rights. Today, the phrase New World Order is used to promote the idea of removing national boundaries. An international body that would be given the task of promoting global policies for the environment, like the Green New Deal, along with other utopian and socialist programs. Colonel North argues that a Biden New World Order would be one where the federal government will dictate whether Americans can forswear fossil fuels while our elites fly around in private jets. In the Biden New World Order, the People's Republic of China will remain ascendant in economic and military power. China is working to control valuable mineral resources and take over Taiwan and its microchip production. He also observes that despite the genocide being perpetuated by Russia in Ukraine, Moscow still intends to use its fossil fuels to control Europe and is helping Iran become a nuclear power that threatens Israel. He concludes by arguing that conservative patriots must retake the House of Representatives and Senate in November 2022 and the White House in 2024. It's time to pay attention to who you are electing to Congress and the presidency. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Mark Christian. And again, he is the Executive Director of Global Faith. We have a link to globalfaith.org. There's where you can find out about his book, 300 pages. I think you will certainly appreciate the book because you'll learn a lot about him, but you'll learn a lot about Islam as you go. Also, of course, Vice President of the Arabs for Israel, and we have information about that as well as the book, which itself has been out since March. So again, some great resources there as well. Mark Christian, let's, if we can, for just a minute, talk about, you have a chapter there, Fatherhood and Brotherhood. And that really brings us to the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood. And Mark, we've spent some time, obviously, trying to educate people about the Muslim Brotherhood. But again, it's probably worth having you speak to this issue, because I think some people think, oh, Muslim Brotherhood, well, that's probably like, oh, I don't know, like a civic group or like the Kiwanis or the Chamber of Commerce. But you actually delve into what actually is at the very core of the Muslim Brotherhood. Can you educate us about that?
Oh, absolutely. So, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood is a vast and enormous organization as of today, and they have so much. And I want to start by this. They have so much influence in the United States today,
yes,
politically and religiously, more than anybody can actually imagine, except for those who are in tune into their work. The Muslim Brotherhood, I want to start by the end so people can get, understand that this is something that they need to learn about and to know about. The Muslim Association, for example, is an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States. They exist in every campus, college campus in the United States. There is no one college in the United States today that does not have a chapter of the Muslim Student Association, which is an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood. Islamic Society of North America is another group that is another arm of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States. Their influence is focused on churches and religious institutions. You have movements like Shoulder to Shoulder movement, or you have the Tri-Faith, or you have the Interfaith. All of those churches that actually bought into the idea of an interfaith has been influenced and actually motivated and pushed and funded by the Muslim Brotherhood arm, which is the Islamic Society of North America. Council of American Islamic Relationship, it's another arm of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States. They are there in D.C. They have been since the 90s, and even before that in another form, different forms. The leader of that is a Hamas sympathizer who has worked with Hamas. He's actually from Palestine, from the refugee camps, came to the United States, and he is right now one of the leading lobbyist Islamist movements in the United States. He has so much influence in many of the political offices, senators, congressmen, administration, institution, and so forth. So the Muslim Brotherhood has, and then you look at Biden administration, lots of Muslim Brotherhood members. Yes. They're not going to have a card of the Muslim Brotherhood, but they're going to have relationship with one of those three organizations I mentioned or something else. There is lots of people with Bernie Sanders. There is lots of people with Obama during his time. There is a lot of influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in our politics, in our culture today, more than can anybody imagine. I happen to know the Muslim Brotherhood very, very, very well. Why? Because actually my great uncle is one of the co-founder of that organization in Egypt. They started in Egypt and they expanded big time to the United States and across the globe.
Well, and again, back even 20 years ago, we were doing articles about this because after 9/11, there was a real desire, I think an honest desire on the part of the Bush administration to reach out to the Muslim world. And so in some respects, without maybe having as much discernment as you would like, brought in some individuals that were having some influence. But then when, as you point out, Barack Obama, who had such connections to the Muslim world, became the president, then you saw that even more significantly. Of course, you see it today. And so there is a real need for not only us as individuals to have discernment, but I think these are questions we're going to start to have to ask individuals that are being elected to political office, to Congress, and even to the presidency, because if you don't understand some of the historical background of some of these different Muslim groups, you will maybe be seduced into thinking that, well, they are just basically peaceful Muslims and they so appreciate what our country is doing and want to extend that. And I want to again salute those Muslims who are patriotic and have served in the military and came here because they want a better life. But I also know that within some of these organizations, there are these individuals that want to implement essentially Sharia law if they can, and to actually have as much influence in our foreign policy as possible.
I have some disagreements with you, if you don't mind, and I hope that you're not going to hate me for that, okay?
No, go for it.
So the first thing is, the Muslim Brotherhood started having influence during Clinton administration. This is way before 9/11. And Hillary Clinton was very instrumental in bringing the Muslim Brotherhood organization into more influence into the government. As a matter of fact, by Dr. Hathout, for example, is a physician, OBGYN, who was a friend of my dad. And he came to the United States after spending some time in Kuwait, and then he came to the United States, and then he lived in California, and he started activism, and he just died a few years back. But he was the very first one that made a speech in the White House on the advice or the invitation of Hillary Clinton. And then later on, when you talked about 9/11, when 9/11 took place, Bush did not only reach out to the regular Muslims and stuff. As a matter of fact, there is an iconic picture that President Bush, 2 days after 9/11, went to the mosque in D.C., and he made his speech and he made his statement about Islam is a religion of peace. And if you look closely at that picture, you will find something very iconic. He was not standing by himself in the podium, but actually there was 6 or 7 people behind him. Those were the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States who are actually standing right behind him and they advise him of his statements and what he has to say. There is another big problem in the United States over here that since 9/11 and before that, when we use the word peaceful Muslims are human beings who are created in the image of God like you and me. But Islam in its core is a political movement. And when we are looking at the danger of the political Islamic movement, we're always looking at terrorist attacks and bloodshed and explosions and suicide bombers and planes running into buildings. All of those existed and they are serious. But as a matter of fact, the successful movement of the political Islam is not by bloodshed. As a matter of fact, it is by advocacy and by influence in a very peaceful way, but a very succinct and very discreet and very effective way. This is why I mentioned the Muslim Association and CARE and Council of American Islamic Relationship and Islamic Society of North America. All of those are very peaceful, very well educated, very influential, having high jobs, very good jobs. They are politicians, they are doctors, they are lawyers, they are accountants. They are very good people who are part of our society, but they have their own agenda. So we should actually start discarding the idea that the political arm of Muslim Brotherhood or Islam in general in the world is all about killing and chasing people in the streets or fighting and explosions. As a matter of fact, it is more of a very discreet political advocacy that is changing America from within to further the cause of Islam.
Again, let's open up the phones because I suspect some of you might have some questions about this as well. Talking about the book, My Search for Truth, The Apostate, which is by Dr. Mark Christian, and we have information about the Global Faith Network, as well as maybe when we come back from the break, we'll spend a little bit of time getting into that in more detail because that is what is oftentimes referred to as civilization jihad. In other words, it's not overt, it's covert. It is certainly used, the freedom that we have in this country right now to begin to change the country from the inside out. So we're going to talk about that, and if we can, maybe get into some other issues. I'll hold up also one of the booklets I've done on Sharia law, which we think of as something that happens overseas, but it's happening right here as we document as well. And I know Dr. Mark Christian will probably be able to give you some information about that. And as we go to the break, let me encourage you to do a couple of things. If you go to our website, which is pointofview.net, we have a link to his website, which is globalfaith.org. There's a place where you can learn a little bit more. There's a place where you can get a book. They have also the monthly news briefing there if you would like to follow a little bit more about what they're doing, listing as well the opportunity for maybe you to have him come and speak if you would be interested in doing so. They also have a outreach called Save the Persecuted Christians Initiative, and so all of that can be found at the website, which is globalfaith.org. Of course, we also have information about the book. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link in case you'd like to get it in hardback or Kindle. Well, let's open up the phones. I suspect many of you have some comments, some questions, areas of agreement, disagreement. That's why we call the program Point of View. The number is 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to join the conversation, ask a question, make a comment to Dr. Mark Christian, and we'll be back. Take some of your phone calls right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Mark Christian. And again, the book is entitled The Apostate, My Search for Truth. And again, we have information about him, about the book, about Global Faith, which is located in Omaha, Nebraska. And we have a link to globalfaith.org. So lots of great resources that are available today. But Dr. Mark Christian, I think it is about time, we've already sort of talked about it, but maybe have you go into more detail about the dangers of civilization jihad. And we've talked about, of course, the influence of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and all sorts of others, CARE and all the rest that maybe have influence in the political arena. You've also talked about happening and even on university campuses. But I think it's fair to say that this is having an influence in churches and civic organizations and a number of other places. So can you help us understand maybe the extent of the attempt to try to change these values in America from the Muslim perspective?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. And, the influence in the churches and religious institutions. So it is huge, number one. And it's not only focused on churches, but it's focused on Jewish synagogues as well. Because, the Muslim Brotherhood early on, way back in the 60s and a little bit before, they realized that America core stays within its religious institution, and this is what the conclusion they came to, and they decided at that time to try to influence the religious institution in America in multiple ways. Number one is to further the cause of Islam and the message of Islam as a religion, and then more importantly is to further the cause of Islam as a political movement. They want to influence the United States, so the United States will help their cause. For establishing not only Sharia law. I think the word Sharia law has been used a lot in the United States, and I don't think it is very accurate. It is furthering the cause of Islam to build or rebuild the Islamic empire back again. We talk a lot about Putin wants to build the Russian empire or the Soviet Union back in place. As a matter of fact, I look at the Islamists trying to rebuild the Islamic empire as more valid and more dangerous than even the Soviet Union. And I understand how dangerous the Soviet Union was to all humanity and the socialist and communist movement. And even again, I'm going to further to say that the communist socialist movement today is backed up and pushed a lot by Islamists in the United States of America and across the globe. It is one thing that the Islamists are relentless in doing, finding any tool that they can use to further their goal. And they are willing, even though, for example, LGBTQ agenda is completely against the teaching of Islam, as you have read in my book, and how much of a big sin that is. But if they figure out that they can use that in the West and help that agenda in the West to further their own cause, they have no problem doing that. And because Islam as a political movement and as a religion allows it. Why? Because in Islam, the concept of using whatever tool to further the cause is more important than the fundamentals and the teachings of them. It's like any political movement. Political movements sometimes, when they want to reach a cause, they try their best to use every tool in their way. And this is exactly what's happening. So going back to the churches today, in America, since 9/11, they have been, bombarded by different ideas. They are being confused about how they can deal with the topic of Islam. And let's just agree on one thing, that really Muslims are very hard to break into when it comes to religion. You mentioned earlier about talking about God is love. Yes, absolutely, God is love, and it's one of the biggest things that influenced me myself throughout my journey out of Islam to the love and the freedom of in Jesus Christ. But here is the thing: the idea of love and the idea of being called in sonship and daughtership with God is blasphemy according to Islam. It's not a foreign concept, it's a blasphemy in Islam. The Quran, the scripture of Islam, talked about these concepts and how Christians are messed up by believing that. So what they do is they try to work and influence churches. They find the churches that are vacant, lacking funding. They go up to the bigger institutions. You look at big, here is a simple thing I would encourage people to do. To go to the Islamic Society of North America website and then search for shoulder-to-shoulder movement, or even just to start by Googling shoulder-to-shoulder movement.
Yes.
And they will see the church denominations that actually signed up to work with the Muslim Brotherhood in changing the message of Christianity. And I actually have the courage to say that this is what they say. They are going to change the message of Jesus Christ, take Jesus out of the picture, and present only the idea of acceptance in the churches, to water down the theology of those churches, and present, ideas that is very easy to be accepted by Islam later on. This is a very interesting kind of movement that I wish people today to do one thing, to go to shoulder movement and to look at the church denominations and to see if their church is one of those churches or not. And you will be super surprised by the number of organizations in America, Christian organizations and Christian churches and Christian denominations that signed up for that kind of movement and that kind of theology that is taking away Jesus from the church.
Well, again, they do this because they are convinced that they really want to be inclusive in maybe the wrong sense of that word. But you go all the way back to just think of the number of presidents we've had or members of Congress that have said Christians and Muslims worship the same God. You've heard that so many times before. And again, in your book, you talk about how, in some respects, as you were trying to earn favor before Allah, that is very different than a gospel presentation where we are saved by grace, not by works, according to Ephesians 2:8-9. And so there is a sense in which once you get it wrong at that level and say that Christians and Muslims worship the same God, you can see how immediately it leads to all sorts of, if I might borrow the term from your book, apostasy that happens in the church and allows all that to take place in the first place.
Absolutely, and they are playing on the ignorance of the people and using the words more than the concepts. And what I mean by that is people don't understand what Muslims worship. And this is why I put this book out with all the concepts of what Islam is all about and what it teaches from a very personal perspective through the personal stories that I mentioned. And they also use the ignorance of the people of the idea of, hey, God is known by his name. As a matter of fact, one of the most amazing things in the Bible is when Moses was asking God, should I tell your people about who you are and who commissioned me? And he says, I am who I am. God is not known by a name. God is known, there is holy names for God, but God is known by his attributions and by his nature. And the nature of God in Islam is a very judgmental God, is a master calling for enslavement, who's a God who can get angry very easily, and God does not want anybody to be called for his love, but actually for his wrath more than anything else. And when you look at the concept and the idea and the principles of who God is, according to the Bible, throughout the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, he's a loving God, he's a caring God, he's God for there to trying to help you, that he needs faith in him, he needs following of him. You look at the sins of David, you look at the sins of even Abraham and so forth. You will see that God has his plan no matter what, and he's looking for the sinners to come to him with repentance, not by works. And, it is a completely different concept between the two. So do not play on the ignorance and do not buy into the ignorance of we worship the same God. This is absolutely not true whatsoever, because God of Islam is different from God of the Bible, not by the different names or the similar names, but by the attributes and the nature of him and what he is calling you to do in this life and what he is preparing for you after life.
Again, we'll take a break, and we'll come back. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Mark Christian. If you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. But again, you talk about the difference in terms of the nature of God, a holy and one that shows love versus one that is sort of a master-slave relationship. And as a result, because there is never an assurance of salvation, all sorts of other very important distinctions that can and should be made. And when churches fail to do that, when they try to be inclusive and try to have unity without necessarily holding true to biblical ideas, of course, you can see what takes place. When we come back, though, I do also want to talk a little bit about what people will find on your website. because that's kind of the solution for some of this as well. The first step, of course, has been education today, as we've been talking with Dr. Mark Christian about his book, but also about some of the resources that are available there and the news briefings and a number of other things. And, of course, if you would want to maybe have him come and speak based on his book and also on his testimony, that would be something, again, that you can find by going to globalfaith.org. And since we also talk about the plight of persecuted Christians around the world, most persecuted Christians are being persecuted in Muslim countries. Well, there are a few communist countries where that persecution is taking place, but a lot of them are in the Muslim countries. They have an initiative, Save the Persecuted Christians Initiative. So we'll come back and talk about some of that right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's take some phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Head to the state of Texas first. Alex, thank you for joining us today. You're on with Dr. Mark Christian.
Hey, you guys. I really appreciate what you guys are talking about. And a lot of what you're talking about goes back to a country called Turkey. And during the Armenian genocide, a lot of Christians were slaughtered, as you know, and our government even recognized that. And a lot of Islam, what it is being used as a political tool, just like the Catholic Church. And so they use religion to basically distort and take over and monopolize control over whole societies. And I see this happening in the United States too, with Islam basically being used to say everybody should be involved and all that, when Islam is completely diametrically opposed to our Constitution and our way of life in the United States of America. And I see Islam and a lot of the big banks, they're working together. And so I just want everybody in the United States to be aware of that, and the financial institutions. That's why they're saying all this inclusivity and the LGBT agenda. It all goes hand in hand with these financial institutions basically trying to consolidate and monopolize the United States under their hegemonic financial system. So
Mark, let's get Mark joined because we haven't really talked about this idea. Sometimes in the banks they want what's called Sharia compliant types of loans and things of that nature. Can you speak to that issue about just the influence of Islam in the banking industry?
Yeah, banking. I appreciate your question, sir. And I would encourage you to actually to get my book, because it's going to explain that it does not go only to Turkey, but way beyond that, and absolutely the Armenian genocide and many other atrocities that took place. And this is not about conspiracies or things. This is affecting our day-to-day life more than you can even imagine. And the minute you start understanding that you will see this is not conspiracy. This are not problem in the far away, but this is affecting your own church today. You can go look at your church and if it's part of it or not, and what is your pastor talking about and the influence of it. Today, Islam is a protected class, even more than LGBTQ, and you cannot say anything about Islam whatsoever. Otherwise, you're going to be, singled and so forth. And Muslims, absolutely, Muslims are very good people. They are, many of them in the United States and serving in the military and so forth, has nothing to do with the bigger Islamic agenda, because some of them, they are not even aware of it. And this is why this book is very good for Muslims as well, to read, to understand, to get a grasp of what's going on, and to see if their country of origins, how they are affected by the political Islamic movement as well. Going back to your question, sir, regarding the banking, banking has been something that is very important actually in Islamic theology since the inception of Islam. The idea of money, the movement of money and so forth. And, the anti-Semitism, where they say Jews control money and control banks, that has actually, also, part of the Islamic literature and Islamic teachings, and even the scripture itself, because they say that, making, prophets and shark lenders and so forth are all Jewish, and you should not do the same thing that the Jews have been doing in history. This is what some of the scriptures talk about in Islam. So coming to the Sharia-abiding, financial institutions, is all about lending money without a high interest or a variable interest and so forth. And it seems very appealing, as a matter of fact, but there is always other things attached to it. And the thing is, it has more influence on the banking and changing our way of life and how things are run in the country and in the West in general, not only the United States, to be more in tune to Islam. It is, again, pushing the idea of the political Islam one step at every corner that they can.
Wow. Let's take some other phone calls. We'll go to South Carolina on the Good News Network. Sue, thank you for joining us. You're on with Dr. Mark Christian.
Hi, Dr. Christian. I applaud you for bringing light to Islam and the hatred involved with that quote-unquote religion. I'd like you to talk about the actual beginning of Islam when they wrote the Quran. It was 700 years later after the Bible was written, kind of plagiarized the Bible by saying that Muhammad turned water into milk. All these crazy things. But my point is, I believe, in my opinion, I know there are peaceful Muslims out there, but until they come forward and start denigrating this Islam, Sharia law, barbaric cult, they're going to be clumped in with them. And unfortunately, like you said, being ignorant is really going to be the downfall, because they may try and institute Sharia law here, but the Constitution, Madison versus Marbury, clearly states any law that is repugnant to the Constitution is null and void.
Sure.
So they, So what I'm getting at, I guess, is how do we eradicate Islam from the planet?
Okay, Dr. Mark Christian, your thoughts?
There's two concepts I want to thanks Sue for your phone call. But here's number one: Muslims are not bad people whatsoever. Muslims are espousing competing ideas with the ideas of the West. They have been doing this for years. If you want to understand or know more and want me to speak about the origins of Islam, I would encourage you to read my book, and it will explain a lot of the origins of Islam and where it came from, because this is where I digged in, and you will find how much of an adherent and how much of a faithful Muslim I was growing up, and it was only by a miracle and the grace of God that today I am free in Christ and free in the United States. So going back to the idea, I want to push hard. Islam is not trying to implement Sharia law in the United States. Is not trying to do that. Islamic movement, political Islamic movement, has one goal. They want to re-establish the Islamic empire. That is a very important concept that people need to understand. And the United States of America, which its political power, economical power, military power, all the powers that the United States represent are very, very useful for the political Islamic movement to use. So instead of making animosity against the United States, they are trying to use the United States for their movement and their influence. And they are trying to influence the United States from within. So the United States change from an enemy to Islam to be an advocate for of Islam. And then all of a sudden, the political Islamic movement will start succeeding in re-establishing the Islamic State again. This is a concept that I wish people would understand. Islam is not trying to destroy the United States of America. Islam is trying to use the United States of America for its cause. It's like a lobbying. Instead of America being an enemy, making America its best tool in their box so they can further their own goal. I wish people understand that concept.
Just before we go, we only have less than a minute. Again, if people would like to contact you and have you speak, like to get a copy of your book, like to get your newsletter, they can just simply go to globalfaith.org, and that's a link we have on our website, and that's a way in which they can contact you and find out more, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And I am putting myself out there. I am encouraging people to start. You know, this is a great country that we have, and our church is worth fighting for, and our country is worth fighting for. I'm not talking about holding our arms. I'm talking about educating yourself, being in tune to the truth, so you can be very effective and being an instrument in God's hand to further His own kingdom on earth. And I would love to help in any way. If you want me to come and speak, if you want me to teach, if you want me to answer questions, I am making myself available to do that.
Again, book is entitled The Apostate, Dr. Mark Christian. And we'll take a break, and we'll come back and get some issues in the news right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I think you guys, y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, we're going to get into some of the issues in the news, and you will notice I've posted a couple of things. One on the decision by a federal judge to put a temporary injunction against Title 42 rescission, or the attempt to eliminate Title 42. We'll talk about what that means a little bit later. Also, the whole issue of Twitter and the decision that was made at Twitter, and even maybe at the behest of Elon Musk, to actually lock down all the changes to the site for fear that some rogue employee might try to sabotage the Twitter platform. I guess that's something you have to pay attention to, but wow, that was amazing to me. And then we'll get into some issues about the culture wars and a couple of other things as well. So we have a lot to cover, but I thought before we did that, yesterday were the oral arguments for Coach Kennedy. And since we've talked about it so often, I thought it might be good to just recap a few things that were said and a few of the questions and comments. It's helpful because it's a great teaching opportunity for us. And you have on one side, of course, First Liberty, and the person representing this is Paul Clement, who is such a gifted, articulate individual who over the years has tried so many different cases before the Supreme Court. And on the other side, representing the school district, was, no surprise here, a lawyer that's with the Americans United for Separation of Church and State. That would be Brian Ketsky. And this was an attempt to address this issue of whether or not Coach Joseph Kennedy, had the right after a game. You got to recognize this is not during school hours, and this is not even during the game. This is after the game, to go to midfield and to quietly pray. There are a lot of things that were added to that, but ultimately that's the issue, whether or not that would be seen as an unconstitutional establishment of religion, which is the argument you're going to get from the one side, and then the argument from the other side is, yeah, but there's two parts to the First Amendment: establishment of religion, free exercise thereof, and does not an individual who is a teacher have the same kind of rights to express free exercise, especially when it's not in the classroom? By the way, there were a lot of questions that came from Justices Sonia Sotomayor, as well as Justice Elena Kagan and others about that issue. But that is kind of a little bit different issue. But as one individual that pulled together some of this material, and this comes from our friends at the Daily group there as well, the Daily Signal, couldn't come up with the name of it. They said, there were a number of questions that were being really addressed by the justices. When a public school employee says a brief, quiet prayer by himself while in school, invisible to students, is he engaged in government speech that doesn't actually have and is not afforded First Amendment protection? Let's recognize that if you're working in a company, yes, you have free speech and you have freedom of religion, but not while you have the uniform on. I mean, you can see how that could be abused. So that's an important question. If not, assuming that kind of religious expression is private and protected by the First Amendment, does the Constitution Establishment Clause require a public school to prohibit it? And I think the bigger issue was, what about the free exercise of an individual? Because even if he was was an employee of the school, even if he was a coach of the football team, what you do after a football game, what you do outside of a classroom, you cannot govern that as well, or else you ultimately say you are basically a slave of that institution. To take it out of that, there's a big debate right now about what, say, a flight attendant can do. But a flight attendant that is not in an airplane, maybe not even an airport, and certainly doesn't have a flight attendant's uniform on, I think he or she should be free to do whatever they do. You understand the situation, and so that is the case. So Paul Clement, representing the First Amendment and representing First Liberty, said that the trial court's findings were that there was only one reason why he was fired, and that is because of religious expression. That's important to point out, because just because you were fired for religious expression and then it turns out you were showing up late to work or you weren't a good teacher, those are important factors. So he made a real point about the fact that it wasn't due to the fact that he was a bad coach. It wasn't that he was a bad person. It wasn't that he was not turning in assignments when he was supposed to, that he wasn't turning in grades when he was supposed to, that he was a bad influence on the kids. None of that. It was solely, his firing was solely based on the religious expression, which I think is important to make the case. And then in multiple letters, the school district mentioned the endorsement of religion 8 times and nothing about any other concern that would justify termination. So that's an important point to remember, because in the back of my mind sometimes when I hear some of these cases, I wonder, okay, were there some other issues involved other than the fact that it seems like somebody was maybe religiously biased against them. Then Paul Clement stressed that previous Supreme Court cases have made it very clear that a school that does not endorse private religious speech is not endorsing it if it fails to censor it. In other words, there was no obligation on the part of the school district to have to censor that, because no one would assume or should assume, based on previous court ideas, that if they didn't censor it, that then somehow the government, or in this case the school district, was agreeing with that. But that apparently did not affect the Ninth Circuit Court's appeals in that regard. Clarence Thomas asked whether or not Joe Kennedy was pursuing free exercise and free speech claims separately or together. Paul Clement noted that Kennedy's case was a hybrid type of case. Yes, because wink, wink, we want to see if we can also establish once again this precedent of free exercise, because almost all these religious liberty cases have had to been dealing with the whole idea of establishment, but free exercise was very important. And then also asking, well, who was he actually communicating to? And Paul Clement said, well, I think he was communicating to God. Pretty obvious there. So then you get some of the negatives. You have Justice Elena Kagan, for example, said that in the Supreme Court cases in the past having to do with school prayer, Engel versus Vitale, and some of those, the justices were concerned that students would feel coerced to participate in religious expression. Well, Paul Clement responded that when a coach is kneeling at midfield by himself, offering a quiet 15-second prayer, there is, by definition, no coercion. If a prayer had been delivered during a post-game talk instead, Paul Clement said, well, there might have been a coercion element, and the analysis would be different, but that's not what took place. And, of course, you had all sorts of other things. Sonia Sotomayor said, well, what if the speech was not private or in public, or what if a teacher prays before the start of a class, or what if the prayer is audible, or what if the individual reads from the Bible? All interesting questions which have nothing to do with this case. But again, there was quite a bit of back and forth. As a matter of fact, usually, now again, I don't claim to be a lawyer, nor do I play a lawyer on television, but I've assumed that most oral arguments last 1 hour. And if you go to First Liberty and want to listen to it, it was pretty much 2 hours. So this was very robust in a conversation and a back and forth. And, of course, we'll watch and see how the Supreme Court rules on this issue of religious liberty. I think we're going to have another victory, but we'll just have to wait and see. Let's take a break. We'll come back and talk about a couple other issues in the news right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As President Joe Biden was leaving the NATO summit in Europe, he talked about his belief that the U.S. should lead in this new world order. No one in the administration felt this remarkable comment should be cleaned up or clarified or corrected. Fortunately, Colonel Oliver North felt that it was worthy of some comment. The idea of a new world order goes back to the 1940s when H.G. Wells published his nonfiction book on the New World Order. He is best known as the science fiction writer who penned The War of the Worlds. He was also a collectivist who believed that a global government was the best way to protect human rights. Today, the phrase New World Order is used to promote the idea of removing national boundaries. An international body that would be given the task of promoting global policies for the environment, like the Green New Deal, along with other utopian and socialist programs. Colonel North argues that a Biden New World Order would be one where the federal government will dictate whether Americans can forswear fossil fuels while our elites fly around in private jets. In the Biden New World Order, the People's Republic of China will remain ascendant in economic and military power. China is working to control valuable mineral resources and take over Taiwan and its microchip production. He also observes that despite the genocide being perpetuated by Russia in Ukraine, Moscow still intends to use its fossil fuels to control Europe and is helping Iran become a nuclear power that threatens Israel. He concludes by arguing that conservative patriots must retake the House of Representatives and Senate in November 2022 and the White House in 2024. It's time to pay attention to who you are electing to Congress and the presidency. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's talk about immigration for a little bit because it all relates to Title 42. I'll explain what that is in just a minute. Then a little bit later, we're going to get into Twitter, what that might mean, Elon Musk and the rest. And we've been talking about Title 42. I suspect you might indeed know what it is, but let's just give you some understanding. Title 42 is one of those provisions which is actually dealing with custom and border protection, and it allows the United States to allow foreign nationals who are deemed to pose a risk to public health. And this was invoked by the Trump administration now basically 2 years ago to summarily expel migrants who crossed the border illegally, often on the same day they arrived, because of the health issue. Now, I'll be the first to admit, and I'm even going to write a piece that'll show up in our Outlook magazine, that the way this was brought about is a little bit on the questionable side, because what you're doing is taking something that applies to a massive pandemic, true, and then using that to actually take care of an immigration problem that has festered for some time. And so we will get into what that means, but certainly the point that I want to make is up until yesterday, there seemed like a very good likelihood that even though Republicans were against the Biden administration ending Title 42, and a good number of Democrats, most of whom are running for re-election, by the way. We'll get to those names and numbers in just a minute. Nevertheless, we're against this. So this was something that you did have a number of Democrats, and to be fair, I'll give you a quote or two before we're done, of some that felt that this was an anti-immigrant piece, or not really piece of legislation, but edict that indeed was causing a problem. But there were a lot of people, especially on the Republican side of the aisle, and a good number of Democrats on the other side of the aisle that didn't want this pulled back. And of course, you know why, because once this no longer is in place, the very significant, almost tsunami of immigrants crossing our border would increase even more if that's possible, and there's every reason to believe that it was. So, yesterday, a federal judge in Louisiana, that would be Robert Summerhays, who, by the way, is a Trump appointee in the U.S. District Court of the Western District of Louisiana, ended this, or at least temporarily blocked the administration from ending, I should say, these expulsions under Title 42 in the U.S. Code. And he was presiding over a particular case that was actually both in Louisiana and in Arizona and Missouri. They ended up first acting on this in Louisiana, but if not, I suspect there might have been a judge in either Arizona, Missouri, someplace where that might have indeed taken place. Again, Title 42 is something that was implemented because of the risk of public health during the coronavirus pandemic, and the argument being made by the Biden administration, which is true, is you don't see a lot of people walking around with masks. You don't see a lot of restrictions. Well, maybe some of you in blue states right now still feel like you have some. But nevertheless, that is the case. What was the impact of this? As of last week, according to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, of about 1.7 million illegal immigrants or migrants or whatever you want to call them have been expelled from the United States under Title 42 provisions. And so that has been a way of addressing illegal immigration, at least in the southern border. Now, of course, this has led to some very strong criticism, and led in large part by, the people you would imagine, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as well as Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and the rest. Now, on April 1st, the CDC announced that it was ending the policy, citing the lowered risk of coronavirus to much of the U.S. population. And so Senate Republicans, in an attempt to deal with this, blocked a $10 billion COVID relief bill on that issue until they would reinstate the policy. While at the same time, you might remember that the Texas Governor Greg Abbott mobilized the National Guard to conduct enhanced inspections of vehicles and even then bus some of these illegal immigrants to Washington. And I might just make a note that this individual that was with the National Guard that tried to rescue two people in the Rio Grande who was drowned, his body was found, and we'll say more about that a little bit later. But this was something that obviously Republicans were against. Matter of fact, that's why they held up that very significant COVID relief bill. But there were a lot of Democrats, at least those running for re-election, that were as well. And you have, for example, Democrats in the states of New Hampshire, Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, to mention just a few, because these were individuals who were all up for re-election. And we'll see, of course, how that helped. But they, I suspect, probably were breathing a sigh of relief because they did not want to have to defend the Biden administration's decision to pull that. But at the same time, they didn't want to necessarily go against the administration either, and it would have put them in a difficult set of circumstances. A couple more facts. By the way, the phones are ringing if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Border Patrol officials and even some people that work in the area of Homeland Security in this current administration have predicted that if you actually removed Title 42, that it could, if you're ready for these numbers, triple the number of illegal aliens presenting themselves at the border to as many as 18,000 a day. I mean, these numbers are just off the charts in this. The Attorney General of Missouri, Eric Schmidt, who was one of the ones that brought the suit, which it first went to Louisiana, so they didn't actually rule in Missouri, but of course it was based on the same thing, said this is a huge victory for border security, but the fight continues on. And of course, as I mentioned, there were probably a couple of nervous Democrats that were probably glad that this judge made it easier on them, just as I suspect there are probably some people in the Biden administration, maybe even some Democrats, that are grateful that the judge removed the mask mandate, because that was something that was very unpopular with the American people. Also, we recognize that the temporary restraining order, which was granted Monday, does prevent the administration from taking action on Title 42 until a hearing takes place on May 13th. Now, I know enough about this administration to suspect that some of them may just go ahead and do some of this anyway, but we'll see. And so the Biden administration saying that Title 42 might actually be an important issue and maybe is an overreach. And so that's kind of the argument that has been made by the administration. But let me give you a couple of other comments as well, because one of the things you are seeing are a few individuals that have been very angry about this decision that have come down. One of those is Representative Raul Valva, I should say, in Arizona. He said, for example, that the Trump-initiated Title 42 was part of an anti-immigrant hate and fear agenda that used the pandemic as an excuse to deny asylum seekers their legal rights to due process. And so being a member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus has been very critical of that as well. And the states made the request as part of a broader suit, arguing that the Biden administration basically has been violating what's called the Administrative Procedures Act, failing to allow any kind of public comment. That was an argument kind of used against the mask mandate. It was also now used in this case against the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, because they didn't provide notice and opportunity for comment on rulemaking and those kinds of things. And so those are some arguments, kind of technical arguments, being used to try to prevent the removal of Title 42. These are the problems you have when you have a Congress that does not address the issue of immigration, does not believe in actual border security, and as a result simply is allowing, because of inaction in Congress, and in some cases inaction from the presidency, to have so many individuals coming into this country. And as was testified the other day, if this trend continues, basically 1 out of every 5 people in this country will be here illegally. And that is not the way to run a country, to have so many people who are not actually here legally, did not go through a process, were not vetted, and also at the same time do not have the full rights of citizenship. So this is an issue that has been around for decades. Don't see it changing anytime soon, but that's a quick overview of what has taken place so far on this issue of Title 42. Let's take a break, though. I suspect many of you want to make some comments about Twitter and Elon Musk, and that's what we're going to focus on right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, we'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to talk about Twitter. And the first question I want to put on the table for you is, in light of the obvious changes that are probably going to take place at Twitter because of the purchase by Elon Musk, are you more likely to use Twitter or less likely to use it? I also recognize there's a good number of you that say, I don't use it. I don't really care. Okay, but there is an issue broader than that. When you look at Twitter, you recognize that there's a certain group of individuals that are not representative of the entire country that use Twitter, but indirectly you benefit from it or are hurt by it because it affects the way news, information, even political ideas are put forth and robustly or not robustly debated. Okay, so that's certainly first issue. Number two, you recognize even of those people that have a Twitter account, they estimate, and I'll give you the round numbers, that about 90% of the Twitter posts come from about 10% of the people on Twitter. For example, every day I try to put my commentaries on both a Facebook page and a Twitter page, but that's about it. You know, I rarely put anything else up there. You have some people that live or die on Twitter, but a lot of those are individuals that we've had on the program. And the spectrum goes from David French on one side, I don't know, Eric Metaxas on the other. I mean, they maybe disagree on certain issues, but you see them up a lot. You probably have some friends that do, but you also have media people. And sometimes when I'm trying to research an area, I go there. So obviously there is the case. Let me make the case for and against. And again, I want to hear your thoughts because maybe you have been saying, I'm going to stay away from Twitter. It's just a cesspool. Or maybe you said, well, I'd like to have an honest discussion about some of these issues. I think this could be a way that I could maybe convince some people about pro-life issues, pro-family issues, some of these religious liberty issues, and put it out there and also see some of the slings and arrows that come your direction. That's just the way it works because it is a free platform out there. But what are some positives? Even if Elon Musk has a light hand on it, and I suspect he will, he's going to be a little busy with, Tesla and space and everything else. He has, first of all, said that he wants to work really hard to try to make sure that it's human beings interacting on Twitter and to deal with this issue of bots. And you might say, well, what's a bot? Well, these are sort of artificial intelligence things going out there. And so when, for example, somebody says something that might be controversial, it looks like hundreds of thousands of people reacted against one of those statements that somebody made, when the reality is a lot of those were just artificial bots. So I do approve of the idea of saying, if somebody's going to protest, each person gets one vote. They don't get kind of the computer-generated multiple votes. So that's a positive. Now, the potential negative of that is some people have pointed out that might end up being something that then would require KYC. Okay, what's KYC? It's know your customer. It's something that was implemented in the banks and things like that, which require, in order to make sure you're not engaged in money laundering, I need to know everything about you. I need to know your name, your address, your phone number, that kind of stuff. I don't think that is what he's meaning. He's pretty libertarian. If he means that, I'll be the first to be against it because we got enough problems around with just the issue of privacy and all the rest and people being doxxed and all of that. I don't think that's what he means, but that's at least a possibility. But I think more likely what he wants to do is let's have a fair system. If 100 people think this Twitter post was really bad, okay, it's 100 people, but not 100,000 people, which is created by some of those bots. Another one that he has I think he will implement it. He wants all of the algorithms open source. Open source is important because you and I may not necessarily be able to read the computer programs, but people that can read the computer programs for the first time might say, oh, well, that explains why, as I've said before, when I post things on Facebook, I get lots of reaction. I put stuff on Twitter, I get None, hardly. And I think probably have been shadow banned, and you probably have as well. And you have people that sometimes get pulled off of Twitter, and you're going, what did I say that was controversial? I was quoting a CDC article that talks about this issue, or I was quoting a reputable scientist. And so it will be, I think, very helpful to have a much more open and transparent Twitter. Now, the flip side of that is if you're not doing a great deal of content moderation, it could be very quickly become the Wild West. And so we'll have to see how that plays itself out as well. But anyway, I wanted to get your thoughts. What are your thoughts about Twitter and about Elon Musk? And I'll get into whether or not this argument and this concern about whether one oligarch, as they say, controls media, how dangerous that is, by reminding you of at least 6 other people that could fit into the category of oligarch as well. But before we get to that, you might notice my second article is where the Twitter platform is now getting locked down. Why is that? There's a real concern that some rogue employees might actually try to sabotage the platform on the way out. They'll just say, I've had it, I'm leaving, but I'm going to ruin this particular platform so that it's a shell of its former self. Now, if you haven't seen that before, you haven't been paying attention, because I remember even back in 2000 and 2001, we were talking about when the individual that served in the Clinton administration left the Oval Office and left the White House and the Executive Office building and places like that. They sort of trashed the place. They took off keys off keyboards, did all sorts of things, just sort of like petulant young kids. I've never had a rental property, but I know a number of my friends that have had rental properties when they've had to actually have people leave the property or maybe even have to evict them. What they come in to see in the property afterwards just, will turn your stomach. So this, I think, is an illustration of the real concern about what could be even the backlash from some of these employees. So nevertheless, that's certainly the case. And so there is going to be quite a bit of comments back and forth from some of these employees. But let's, if we can, take a couple of other things that Elon Musk has said, and then some of his critics. First of all, in his statement, he wrote, "Free speech is the bedrock of a functioning democracy, and Twitter is the digital town square where matters vital to the future of humanity are debated." And this kind of comes together with some of the other things he's talked about before, saying that Twitter is kind of the de facto public square. And so a public square is one where different views, even ones you would disagree with, are aired and debated and discussed. And so that is the case. He also, in one of his Twitter posts, said this he thinks format and platform has a tremendous potential, and he says he wants to unlock some of the individuals that have been locked down and make the platform better than ever. And somebody was going through the number of individuals that are not on Twitter, either were banned from Twitter or have left Twitter. And I'm not just talking about the President of the United States, because it looks like right now Donald Trump says he wouldn't even go back on Twitter anyway. But I'm talking about some pretty high-profile individuals, most of whom have been on this program, others that are well-known that haven't been on this program. And when you look at the millions of followers they have that then just moved over to, I don't know whether they did, maybe now Trump's, was it Truth and Getter and some of those? I mean, it's really interesting. But nevertheless, this is back to what Elon Musk is saying. He wants to enhance Twitter with some new features, which he didn't provide too much, but certainly one of those was the opening the platform's algorithms to open source to increase trust, and also really said he wants to try to defeat the spam bots, and by finding some way to authenticate that these are real human beings. And so I thought it was very interesting indeed of what he said. Now, let's, if we can, talk about the concerns. Probably the best illustration came from one individual writing on MSNBC, who, first of all, on air was panicking because he said, it's quite possible that Elon Musk could secretly ban one party's candidate or all of its candidates or all of its nominees, or you could just turn down the reach of their stuff and turn up the reach of something else, and the rest of us might not even find out about it till after the election. And when he said that, I'm thinking, did you not protest at all what happened 2 years ago? And I don't think that he did, because the concern was that you could secretly ban one party's candidate, secretly turn down the reach of another, and that wouldn't be even visible till afterwards. And first of all, that's exactly what was done to Donald Trump. It was certainly what was done to the Hunter Biden laptop. And yet, again, maybe just no self-awareness that this has actually already happened, and that having open source would pretty much prevent that and also allow people to know that when it did happen. Anyway, got to roll my eyes on that one. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and if you want to get something to write with, I'm going to give you something that might give you some talking points if you want to get out on Twitter, Facebook, or maybe even just a conversation with some other individuals. But before we do so, let me just mention my third article we really won't get to today, but I did post it for you to read if you would like. It's by Nathaniel Blake. Nathaniel Blake. I don't know him, but he's now actually kind of a postdoctoral fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Center, which, by the way, is an organization I used to be involved with when I was at Georgetown. And it's about the culture war. And in particular, I think what started it was there was a piece by Charles Blow, who was a columnist for the New York Times, basically shocked, first of all, that the approval rating for the president is so low, and then saying that this is due to the fact that Republicans are engaged in a culture war and they're just using it to run down his numbers. And I appreciate Nathaniel Blake is saying, no, we didn't pick this fight. As a matter of fact, in many cases, we've, as conservatives in particular, and Christians, oftentimes we just want to go about our day. But if you're going to keep teaching these kinds of things to our kids, and you're going to be stating these kinds of things, eventually we're going to stand up and say, no, that's not right. But in many of these cases, and many of the examples used by Charles Blow, these are ones which were initiated by the liberal progressive wing of the Democratic Party, sometimes even the extreme radical wing, and they are the ones that started it, and eventually even mom and pop have to stand up and say, you know what, I think there's something wrong here. We need to go to the school board meeting and express our opinions and all sorts of things like that. So anyway, it's the third article. I called it Culture War and Voters. And of course, you're going to get all these kind of columns because there is a real understanding on the part not only of the Republicans, but now the Democrats that this is going to be a tsunami, which we've been talking about for some time. Matter of fact, Friday, Dr. Merrill Matthews, who wrote that book and that article about the coming red tsunami, will be with us again. So we'll just get an update on that because even more recently, these Democrats that have said, I'm not sure we want to pull Title 42, were doing so because they were looking at rather bleak re-election opportunities for them. But the reason I suggested you might want to get something to write with, and you could number 1 to 6, I found this the other day, and I'll hold it up for people that are watching online. But what it is you've been hearing for some time from some of these people so critical about, well, it just doesn't seem right that an oligarch like Elon Musk should be able to control one form of the media. First of all, the word oligarch has been completely redefined. There is a proper definition for it, and referring to him or anybody else in America as an oligarch is a bit much. But okay, if you want to use that illustration for just a minute, the question that I love to ask is, where was your concern in the past when Jeff Bezos or a number of others purchased these major news organizations? I think if you want to be fair, first of all, I think there's a real possibility, and I was sharing this with Steve Miller, our producer, because I've seen that it's interesting to all of a sudden see Jack Dorsey and Elon Musk kind of doing some communication back and forth, and they're all really believing in this idea of even having a decentralized kind of form of communication. So if anything, what you may get from him is something where he has such a light hand, it really becomes pretty decentralized. But let's give you the 1 to 6. Number 1, Jeff Bezos paid, as far as I can tell from this graph here, $250 million for the Washington Post. Jeff Bezos, who is he? Well, he's the founder of Amazon. He's worth $156 billion. So, first of all, you haven't heard a lot of people complain about Jeff Bezos controlling the Washington Post. And believe me, there's pretty good evidence that he's had a pretty heavy hand on some of the editorial content. Let's go to number 2. John Henry has paid $70 million for the Boston Globe. Again, you might say, well, who's John Henry? Well, it's John Henry and Company, and he's worth $2.6 billion. Let's now go to number 3, the Las Vegas Review-Journal. Sheldon Adelson purchased that for $140 million. And to be fair, he's the closest you have to a conservative on this list because he has supported Newt Gingrich and a number of others. Most all these others tend to be very definitely liberal progressive supporters and supporters of Democrats. But okay, there's Las Vegas Review-Journal. Let's take number 4, The Atlantic. We quoted from that Atlantic as well. I can't tell you how much she paid for it because guess what? The deals are not available, but that's Lauren Powell Jobs. Do you remember Steve Jobs? Anybody remember Steve Jobs? Yeah, she's worth $20 billion herself, and she owns The Atlantic. So that's what, number 4. Let's take number 5, the purchase of the Los Angeles Times. That was $500 million. That comes from Patrick Soon-Shiong, who is actually a biotech startup, including Nanty Health and a number of others. He's worth about $7 billion. And then number 6, Time Magazine, $190 million. That comes from Mark Benioff, and he is, of course, with Salesforce, $6 billion. So I give you right here 6, if you will, oligarchs. Of course, they would never call them oligarchs. It's only Elon Musk is an oligarch. But if you want to use the same definition, there are 6 individuals, all worth billions of dollars, all have purchased these media organizations. And then, of course, you can add to the conglomerates, of which there are many. You start talking about Disney and ABC and, oh, I forgot about Bloomberg. Yeah, well, there's another one. I mean, again, the list is so long. To have people get so upset about this is amazing to me, but it's just a good illustration of when it's a conservative, and I really have difficulty calling Elon Musk a conservative. He's different than some of the other liberals on this list, but hardly a conservative, pretty libertarian on a lot of issues, and not even all that conservative on other issues, but nevertheless. But when he's all of a sudden going to control Twitter, well, the hue and cry is heard from coast to coast. And yet, how many times did you hear anybody complain about any of this? And so I just thought I'd share with you something that you probably won't hear the mainstream media talking about, because after all, they're the mainstream media, and they're the ones that have been purchased by that. Well, just before we end, I did want to do a tribute to an individual, and that is when we were talking about immigration, I mentioned that we had someone who is with, of course, the Texas National Guard who died the other day, and his name is Bishop Evans. And I love what Gary Bauer says. You probably didn't hear his name on the networks because, except for Fox News, most didn't really want to talk about it. He says the same leftists who wanted to smear the Border Patrol agents who were on horseback. Remember the last time we talked about Border Patrol agents, we were told that they were whipping those individuals, those migrants. They weren't, but that's the case. But nevertheless, a tribute, if nothing else, to Bishop Evans, young man, African-American, member of the Texas National Guard, died when he jumped into the Rio Grande River trying to rescue 2 migrants who appeared to be drowning. He succeeded in saving them, apparently, but lost his own life. His body was recovered yesterday. It's believed that the people he saved were actually trafficking drugs for the cartels. So he gave his life for something that I think some of us would have just turned our back on. And if nothing else, why is the Texas National Guard there in the first place? Well, it's because we have an administration that simply does not want to control the border. And so I thought, since very few other news outlets are talking about Bishop Evans, we'll mention his name today. First of all, Doug, I want to thank you for your help as an engineer, setting in for Andrew. And Steve, thank you for all that you do to produce this program. We're going to have our Millennial Roundtable tomorrow, and then I'll be back with you on Thursday. And, of course, we'll have our Friday weekend edition. And if you want to find out more, you'll find it at the website, pointofview.net. And we'll see you back tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.